Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forgotten Generation podcast, hosted by Troy Njenje Mbanga. This podcast is about amplifying young people's voices and the journeys they're on. I am joined by Winter, who is a young NCB advisory group member and a youth advocate and a college student. Would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Hi everybody, my name is Winter. Like Troy said, I am a college student. I'm 17 years old, so I'm doing my A-levels. I study politics, philosophy, history, and drama, and I really enjoy all of these subjects.
It's amazing, and it's so great to have you on today's episode. And actually, when you listen to this, it will be Pride Month. So we're going to be celebrating Pride as well. And so the first question is, what is your youth voice journey?
Well, what a great question. It covers so much. I think I really started my youth voice journey in, I would say, mid-secondary school, definitely coming out of COVID. I think I was deeply unhappy with my secondary school. I don't think I felt represented. I don't think I felt listened to. And through that, I think youth advocacy and specifically self-advocacy, which is how I think everyone gets their start, it became a necessity. And yeah, there were practically no avenues in my secondary school for student voice, for student leadership, for anything like that. And it became really frustrating. So self-advocacy, it didn't just become advantageous to me. It was necessary to vent some of that frustration. I think that's something a lot of people will be able to relate to. And I'll say I definitely had that frustration for longer, but I think it was around the age of 14 that a lot of the opportunities for me to actually, do something productive about it started to open up. So yeah, it was around the age of 14 that I joined my local youth assembly, which is, linked to the council, and it's a great way to advocate for youth voices. It's a great way to get listened to. I'd recommend to any listener to Google to see if they have a local youth council. Sometimes it's called youth assembly. Yeah, great way. There's also a youth board, which is advisory, and you can advise on your council's youth services. That's something I also got involved with. That was amazing. During my time, I put forward a motion on encouraging democratic school councils as a form of youth voice in secondary schools in my borough. And I got that passed, and I worked on that for some 18 months before it got adopted by the Barnet's where I live, Barnet Education and Learning Trust, I think it's called. And yeah, that was amazing to see actually implemented from start to finish. And again, it was about this time, perhaps a little bit later, that I joined YNCB, which is the Young National Children's Bureau. I'm sure if you listen to the Forgotten Generation podcast regularly, you are well acquainted with it. And that was amazing. Through that, I got to speak at the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Children, which is really, the upper echelons of youth advocacy. You're speaking directly to those decision makers, MPs, lords, and the such. And yeah, it was also about the same time that I got into climate activism, which is something that, you hear a lot about and is also, very predominantly youth-led in a lot of movements. I got involved with Extinction Rebellion, and I got involved with Just Stop Oil, and I did that for a couple of years before moving on to other things, and that has kind of continued up until now. I'm now chair of Barnet Youth Assembly, is what it's called. I'm at a different school, I'm pleased to say, where there's a lot more student voice and student leadership, which I'm part of. And, I stay very political. I attend marches as often as I can, often marching with the Jewish bloc, my faith being quite important to me. Organisations like Na'amod and Va'ahavta doing really great work. So yeah, that's kind of me now.
Wow, so much you have done. That is such an incredible introduction to your journey and just what you're doing, and just so much you've done over the past few months, years. You're honestly incredible. You should be so proud of yourself and just where you've gone and everything, and it's just so remarkable. And so, who inspired you to make a difference, and what made you want to be part of marches and being part of Young NCB Advisory Group and being so unpolitical on things?
I think that my parents absolutely played a part in that. I suppose everyone's parents really inform who they are now, a bit of nature versus nurture, but Yeah, I was definitely raised in a culture of social action. I know my mum was very involved in the CND movement in the 80s, which, if you don't know, is nuclear disarmament. Back when that was very big and a lot of anti-Thatcherite protests. She became president of her student union at university. That was very much her life. Equally, my dad's a social worker. He specializes in disabled children. A large part of his job is advocating for young people who are unable to advocate for themselves. And I think through both of them, I really learned, how advocacy, particularly self-advocacy, is so important and is such a useful tool in day-to-day life, but especially when you're a young person. Also, I'd be remiss to forget that again, my faith plays a huge part in that. I've been a part of a lot of left-wing Jewish youth movements. One in particular, LJY, Liberal Jewish Youth, helped, raise me in that culture of social action. And through that, I met some, amazing role models. I think of one in particular, a man called Joe Shotton, who I really looked up to. And I think he's moved on from that now, but he's a bit older. And I think he does a lot of work advocating for immigrants now, I think. He's doing some legal stuff now. So I think he's continued above and beyond youth advocacy, and yeah, no, he's a really big role model.
Wow, so many people who have helped you in your journey, who inspired you, also just and your faith. And I think that's just so beautiful because I know being Christian, I find it helping me to be who I am. It's really made me just believe that I can do things and believe that anything's possible and that your voice matters. And I love that you had people around you who kind of just helped you along the way, who very much became that role model for you, which I think helps a lot when you're starting out in your voice. And is there ever times that you felt barriers when you had a voice, that you felt like you couldn't be able to and do this because you felt judged?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the biggest driver of barriers for student voice, I'm sure many people have said, is ignorance. When we know, as I'm sure the listeners know, young people are capable of so many amazing things, right? And we so innovative and bring so many new ideas, new fresh ideas to the table. But the biggest barrier is when you're not listened to. It's not for lack of quality of ideas, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. And so when, decision makers, adults are, ignorant to the facts that young people bring so much to the table, we get sidelined, we get marginalized. And, these biases, often unconscious, it's rarely a conscious effort to exclude children and young people. But when these biases go unchecked, it becomes structural. So again, I bring up the example of my old school that had no avenues for student voice or student leadership. I'm sure that started long before I was there, with just one person saying, no, actually, I don't think we need to listen to young people. Actually, I think we probably know better. We've got more life experience. There's no need. And then that, perceived lack of need turned itself, into a self-fulfilling prophecy, where actually no one could advocate for themselves. And so it was assumed that they couldn't, which is never the case. I'm a sincere believer that everyone is capable of advocacy, just given the opportunities and given the right spaces. But I think that's a huge barrier for so many people, the lack of space. I do think, particularly before I was 14, there were no spaces. No one wants to listen to you. And after that, I found more and more spaces. Now I'm 17, there are even more spaces. And things do unlock as you get older. Absolutely. But I think that's unfortunate. I think people are really missing a trick by not listening to, even younger children. I think that's something that people my age get wrong. I think it's very easy to look down at where you were and think, God, I was so ignorant. I knew nothing. But actually, I think of myself, 13, 14, and I think, well, actually, I had some good ideas. I had some awful ideas. But wouldn't it have been wonderful if I was listened to anyway? I think that there's so much power in just being listened to.
Brought back a good point, but actually, and a lot of people like us sometimes actually forget the younger young people who might actually have the ideas, who might have the good ideas about different things change, the education system, all of the issues that they are passionate about, but we kind of just and forget that, and we're so focused on us guys as teenagers like 17, 18, 19, 20, and so on and so on. And we forget actually there's also young people also that want to have that voice, about want to maybe have a say, and maybe they've got a great idea. And but us guys were just thinking, no, it won't work, it won't be a good idea. But actually maybe it is a good idea. And I think it's creating those spaces like you said. I think that's the value that's lacking, is that there's not much spaces for young people to even have a say. And there's less opportunities as much. And we need to create more opportunities for those young people to actually come into the room and actually speak to those professionals and those people in power to be like, this is what needs to happen. Like, listen to us. And that brings me to, what do you think are the three issues that young people are facing right now? And what do you want and decisions makers and professionals to do even more better?
Well, I mean, I think it's hard enough to just pick three issues. But yeah, I can think of a few that are particularly important to me and other young people I meet. I think one is definitely a sense of political disenfranchisement. I think so many young people do not feel represented in politics. And that, kind of like I was saying before, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If young people are unwilling to engage in politics, then politics will not engage with them. And that fuels the ignorance, that fuels us not being listened to. And it's awful. I do think that it's awful that the onus is on us as young people to engage with politics. And actually, politics should be working for us, whether we want to work for it or not. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And I think we have to work with the reality, and we have to get other young people as engaged as, perhaps we are, perhaps people in the organizations that we work with are. So that politics works more for young people. Although I do think there is another side to that, which is political education. There is so little of it. Young people can go their entire school lives and be totally ignorant to everything that's going on around them, the politics that do affect them. I think that's something people often forget, that you might not want to have a say in politics, but politics has a say over you. You will be affected no matter what. It's just about whether you want to have a say in that. And frankly, I think everyone should have a say in how politics affects them. And obviously that starts with education, bringing people from out of a place of ignorance that they often find themselves in. Knowledge very much is power. I think that's a very common theme in a lot of what I'm bringing up. And I've been talking about that for a while, and that's just one issue. I think another important issue, though, is mental health. I think that's something that keeps on coming up in conversations again and again and again amongst young people. To personalize it a bit, I'm not gonna be anecdotal, but I think particularly for people my age, 17, 18, 19-year-olds, a huge issue is the crossover from CAMS to adult mental health services. I've met young people my age, in particular 17, who say they're really struggling with their mental health. They would really benefit from CAMS, which is child adolescent mental health services, if any listener doesn't know, who would really benefit from CAMS intervention. But CAMS are very unwilling to work with them, knowing that they would be moving to a different body, adult mental health services, very soon. And I know for people who are already in the CAMS system, that crossover is not smooth. It's a very arduous process. It's something that comes up time and time again. And, health agencies just not working with each other. And ultimately, that's just going to affect us. They can live with it, the organizations. But children and young people can't a lot of the time. And kind of my third issue that I wanted to bring up, topical both to Pride Month, but also to some current affairs, is trans and non-binary young people, who I think have not been listened to in quite some time. And I think their issues are very unique. I think they get trivialized far too much. And the reason why I say it's so topical is because Yvette Cooper, our Home Secretary, recently released draft EHCR guidelines for how companies, how organizations, how public bodies can interact with not just trans young people, but trans people as a whole. And the feedback from trans people has been overwhelmingly negative. I'm not going to fearmonger about what it might mean for the future. I think there's far too much of that. But I have to say, I personally was not pleased, and I'm not going to get into it because I think it would take far too long and it would dominate. We could talk for another hour about this, I'm sure. But I'm sure we will hear more about it over the next weeks, and when this episode comes out, I'm sure the situation will have changed entirely So I'm not going to speak on it too much, but I do think that a lack of youth voice, particularly for trans and non-binary young people, is a real issue.
Thank you so much for all of those issues. I think our government needs to take these issues very seriously and around politics for young people to educate young people about politics a bit more. Mental health, moral support, CAMS and the adult services are accessible for young people and giving that support and not make it too late for those young people to get that support that we need. Also, I did say earlier in the episode that obviously Pride Month when the episode comes out, and so that brings me to and what brings you joy and being
Yeah,
part
I
of a
think
Pride
that.
community.
I mean, that's a good question because I think so much discourse about the LGBTQ plus community is negative, overwhelmingly negative. Actually, both within communities and from outside of it, I think it's a bit of a negative feedback loop. When you look in the media, everything feels so negative, and that bleeds into the community where the conversations are just so negative. And yeah, I touched on that a little bit. I do think there's a lot of fear mongering about the future um, of the LGBTQ plus community. So I think it's amazing that you're asking a question about joy instead. I think that's really wonderful. As for what brings me joy, I do think that just spending time in these communities, and particularly when you're in a space where you all share that thing in common, I think helps it feel very normal in a world where you're often made to feel not normal because of your identity, because of who you are, which is really horrible, but it kind of follows you. And so to be able to have a space where you all share that thing in common and you're able to normalize it does bring me so much joy. Because you don't even need to talk about it, you just know. Okay, there's a lot of shared lived experience that comes up in discourse, and I think that really does bring communities together, even when that shared lived experience is often negative. I think being able to share it in a space full of people who can relate, I think, can kind of take what's quite a negative thing and make it positive. I think that the transformation of that is just astonishing for me. I think I'll never get over it, how amazing and how powerful it is to be able to take your own negative experiences and turn it into something positive. It's not ignoring it, it's not pretending it doesn't exist, it's confronting it face on and doing something about it. And I think you feel the same thing when you go on marches in political movements as well. Despite the fact that you're all in that space for what's normally a negative reason, protest movements, you're protesting against something rather than for something a lot of the time. I think the sense of community that brings is its own positive. And again, that's taking something that is negative, the thing that you're protesting against, and turning it into something positive in that it brings so many people together for the same cause, people who would otherwise not see each other and not interact with each other. And I think we come out the other side of it better as a community.
Absolutely, and I think that's just so important. And I'm so glad it brings you joy. I'm so glad that community actually means something to you, and it's so important for others to feel seen and feel belonging, but also feel like they can come out and feel like they don't have to hide it. As I know a lot of young people sometimes feel like they need to hide who they are. They don't know how people will react. And I think it's so important that, and to just be yourself and to know that people will still love you, even if you are who you are. And also, and for those views, and that's okay. And the community is strong, and we should be coming together, not taking the community out and not kind of like breaking it. We all should be coming together and celebrating it. And so what are your hopes for people to understand about Pride, understand who you are?
These are such good questions. I mean, you could take just one of these questions, and that would be enough to fill the episode, really. But I think during Pride Month in particular, it's really important for people to understand how much more work we have to do. I think it's easy to set benchmarks for, equality and let that dictate a whole movement. I think a lot of very well-meaning people from outside of the community will look at a thing like marriage equality, which of course, we do have in the UK and we're lucky to have, and say that that's the pinnacle of Pride as a movement. But as we know, and as I've touched on already, there's a lot of common themes. There is a lot of work to do, particularly with trans and non-binary people and trans and non-binary young people in particular. Young people as a whole, as well, perhaps to link it to the themes of the podcast a bit more. Queer young people get so overlooked, and community building is very difficult for queer young people, much harder than it is for queer adults for so many reasons. My hopes for people is, yeah, firstly to understand how much more work there is to be done and to, obviously celebrate with us, celebrate our successes, and, you're welcome to do that. And I think you see that, even just in like pride marches. It is very celebratory and people really do enjoy that, and it attracts huge crowds every year. I normally planning on attending this year, and that's great, but there is a caveat to that, which is, if you want to celebrate with us, what I ask is that you advocate for us as well. You're there for us in times of success. We need you to be there in times of strife and in times of grief and in times of immense difficulty, which we do find ourselves in. What it means to be an ally is to be with us through that whole journey. And I think you do get, again, very well-meaning individuals who are only there to celebrate with us and less to advocate with us. But it is very much two sides of the same coin, in that we get to celebrate because of the challenges. And I don't like to use this term, I think it's a disgusting term, but it's unfair even for others to celebrate during successes and not be with us in those challenges. You don't have to go through those challenges, and I'm so pleased for everyone who doesn't, but you do have to be an advocate, I think that's really important.
Thank you so much, Winter, for that. Because I think it's very important, and I hope listeners took away on what you said there. And so what would be one piece of advice to a young person wanting to make a difference?
Very hard question, because I struggled for a very long time to get my voice heard, so it is never easy. And I think we're all here to say that, to try and make it easier, and that one day it will be completely natural for a young person to have their voice heard. Unlike now, where it's, to have a young person stand in a room of decision makers and say their piece, it's shocking. It has shock value. I think that's a very funny concept. But in terms of my advice, put yourself out there. There's no harm in trying things and saying that they're not for you. Not everyone is going to be the next Greta Thunberg. Not everyone is a big speech maker. I don't consider myself particularly a very good orator. I think that standing in a room full of people and just talking at them is my worst nightmare. And that's not to say that I haven't done it, though. I think that's important. To advocate for yourself, you have to step outside your comfort zone, because unfortunately, in the world that we live in, it's never going to be comfortable as a young person to have your voice heard. It's not going to be easy, and I think that what we're trying to do is to make it easier. But that's an ongoing process, and at the moment, it's just going to keep on taking more and more brave young people who are willing to step outside of their comfort zone to make it easier for the young people after them. And then one day, God willing, that it won't be the case anymore. But yeah, there have been so many times where I've done something, I've tried it, and I've said, you know what, this isn't for me. And there's no shame in that. But I think more times, maybe, I've tried something and said, you know what, this is for me. And had I not stepped outside my comfort zone, maybe I never would have discovered this. My life would look very, very different had I not tried that. So yeah, my number one advice for young people: be brave, try things, advocate for yourself.
I love that piece of advice. And I'm definitely going to take it away with me as well. I think it's so powerful what you said, Winter. So thank you so much for that. And to finish this episode, what would be your Forgotten Generation
so hard
podcast
to
quote,
just
and to sum up your journey?
I've been talking for much longer than I thought I would be able to. I thought I didn't have much to say initially, but I think it might just be what I said before. I think, if I had to quote it, it would just be brave and advocate for yourself. It's very simple. But I think, like you said, it is a powerful message.
Absolutely. And
thank you for inviting me.
So wonderful, that quote. And that's a great way to end this episode. So thank you so much, Winter, for coming on today. I talk about your youth voice journey, but also celebrate Pride Month with me. And I hope listeners took away on what you said. For any listeners who are going to Pride this month, have a wonderful time at the parades, and the celebration goes incredibly well. Thanks for listening to the podcast episode. This is a Beaver Change Media Network production. Please support the podcast by subscribing and rating the podcast. I'd love to hear what you like and what could be better for future episodes. If you want to find me, you can find me on Instagram and I will .troy, and also on X I will _Troy. Tune in to next week's episode.